in the Netherlands, we stand by Tibet. And with this very important week, as Chödunla just explained, just ahead of us, it is incredibly powerful to have Jamyang Norbu here with us. This is someone who was 10 years old when the uprising in Tibet took place. And he is a person that was part of and followed and documented a lot of what has happened since. It is unbelievable that we are standing here today in 2025 and the situation in Tibet still is very there. And that's also why this book is so incredibly powerful. It's really a momentous piece of writing by Jamyang Norbu. He is a well-known Tibetan author, playwright. He published books, polemics, is also a writer that is known for his capacity to speak his heart, and sometimes maybe people don't agree, but he really contributes to the debate. He went to school in Kalimpong, and when he was, actually how old was you when you joined Chushi Kangdruk? 18. At age 18, he joined the resistance army that fought against the Chinese in Tibet. And this is part of Tibetan history that not everyone knows in much detail, but it's a very important additional storyline on top of the many visions and the many inspirations that we have about Tibet. Tibetans did not just stand by, they actually fought against the Chinese. And I've promised that I won't relate the Tibet story to today's world, but reading this book, we really see how messy a situation like this can be, with a powerful person with an army behind him that is bullying the leaders of another nation, and the messiness of war, which of course is terrible. But every time when we read a book like this, and that's why this book is so important, we realize that this happened in our days, and that it is still happening, and that it's also happening further away from where we live, for example in Tibet. So I'm very impressed by the way you write your personal story, and at the same time create an incredible, comprehensive overview of all that happened after the Chinese takeover. I think the rest you will show and share with us, but very much welcome to Jamyang Norbu, and thanks for being here.
First of all, I have to thank ICT Holland, Europe, its director Wangpo Chatong, and Tenzin Chödunla, who took care of all my program here, not only here, but earlier in London and in Paris, which all went off without a hitch and was really successful in its own way. And then also I have to thank Jan Willem here for moderating, and oh, thank you, yeah. And of course, I have to thank everyone here for turning out on this really nice, brilliant day when you could be outside in a cafe or bar enjoying yourself. I hear that such days are rather uncommon in Holland, but you've sacrificed the sun and come out here to listen to me. And I just want to start by touching on the next couple of days. We have the March 10th, I think. And I came across what the Dalai Lama had written a message, and it was published in the Washington Post a day or so ago. And I think it's important. I'm just going to read an excerpt. He said, on March 10th, Tibetans everywhere in the free world will be commemorating the 66th anniversary of the Tibetan people's uprising in Lhasa. The right of the Tibetan people to be custodians of their own homeland cannot be indefinitely denied. Nor can their aspirations for freedom be crushed forever. Tibetans have spent nearly 75 years fighting for freedom. Their struggle should continue beyond my lifetime. Now, this is a message that His Holiness has left us. So I think it is appropriate that I should talk about my book here. Because this book is, in some ways, not entirely, the history of Tibetan struggle against communist China's occupation of Tibet. So for a long time, I wanted to write a major work on Tibet's war of resistance against Chinese imperialism. Over the decades, I had written plays, essays, and even a couple of books on the subject, and reports for the exile government and other agencies. You know, I've been doing all these books, even plays, as Chukila and Namgyal Hamala, who was here, will testify to. And I wasn't unfamiliar with the subject. My challenge was essentially one of genre. I wanted to write about a critical period of a nation's story, not as conventional history or journalism. I sought to create something inspirational enough to fire the imagination of a new generation of Tibetans, and only a substantial and captivating literary work could immerse young minds in the story of the Tibetan freedom struggle and hopefully make it a crucial part of their lives. Now, I cannot claim to have accomplished that. You know, it's only time that will tell. But I put in 15 years just on this book. And so I have to thank my wife, who's a doctor, and she paid all the bills while I was doing it. And I took inspiration from Tolstoy's War and Peace, at least in the size of the book, if not in the content, you know, and the skill. But I didn't want to write a novel, really. I believed that the stories of the many Tibetans I had encountered, officials, peasants, housewives, muleteers, lamas, merchants, tribal chieftains, spies, resistance fighters, and even a great yogi who I met actually in a Tibetan pub in Dharamsala. All these stories were rich and compelling enough for my narrative purpose, so I didn't have to create characters. They were already there. I knew most of these people personally, and I'd interviewed them extensively. In some cases, the people who I'd interviewed, I published their accounts as biographies in the publishing house in Dharamsala that I was part of, the Amnimachan Institute. So my task was to weave all these elements into a cohesive narrative whole to tell the story I wanted to share. This was, of course, easier said than done. I had many limitations, the least being, as Jan Willem explained, I left home, I left school. You know, I didn't have much of an education. I never went to university. So just to get the book started, I fell back on the most fundamental literary technique, the first-person narrative, and began the story of my own account of being born in Darjeeling on April 14th, 1949, and my journey to Lhasa a few months later. I won't go into details about my family background. It's pretty interesting. It's scandalous in certain parts, but you know it is very interesting, and it's all in the book. My father's family were originally from Kham, Eastern Tibet, and later served in the Royal Court of Sikkim, and subsequently the British Raj also. So, you know, politically speaking, very incorrect. My maternal grandfather, my Tatong Gyume Gyatso, my mother's father, was a military and political figure who participated in the 1911 campaign to expel the Manchu forces from Tibet. So it's not only communist China, the Manchus, the nationalists, we had problems with it. He later fought in the 1918 war to liberate Tibet. His notable career included service as Governor General of Eastern Tibet, and in the mid-1930s he was appointed as a cabinet minister in the Tibetan government. So this first image that you see here was when my family went to, after I was born in Darjeeling, we went back to Lhasa. And I think this was my father's picture. I think I found it in his collection. Our caravan outrider on the way to Lhasa. I think his name, if I remember right, was Tundup Gemba, the older Tundup. He was one of the servants there. And this is our caravan resting on the way to Lhasa before around Tromo. And my mother's in the back, you don't see her very well. In the front, having tea, is my nanny, Pema Tsawang. She died 7 years later after the communist occupation. She died of starvation. So these are our horses and all the people. That's when we were happy and living in a beautiful country. And the next picture is of my nanny again, with me sitting on her lap. And our horses and actually even a waterfall at the back. So the whole idea of Tibet being Shangri-La is not exactly fiction. There was a reality to it. So and then of course there's me in Lhasa. This is in the Tetong house in Banakshil neighborhood. You can see the potala at the back. And my dad looking very snappy with his shades. And he was wearing those riding boots, which at that time were the height of fashion in Lhasa. They're called Jurta Yuring, jack boots that were manufactured in Kalimpong by a Chinese bootmaker. All Tibetans know this. It's like if you were someone in Lhasa at that time, you had to wear it. And that's my mother holding me. And just to expand a little on this period, although it was a happy time when I got there in June, July of 1949. When we came into Lhasa, when we rode into Lhasa, I don't remember now, I don't pretend to. My mother told me all about this later. We saw a comet, in south of Lhasa in the mountains. And that was a great comet of 49. And for Tibetans also, comets are inauspicious. So already people were sort of getting a little scary about what's going to happen in the future. And China had already, the civil war in China between the Kuomintang and the communists was coming to an end. And we knew the communists were winning. So it was very scary. So the Tibetans really didn't know what to do. The Tibetan government was not prepared, and we were all very nervous. And Tibetans, of course, the worst thing was none of us had seen a communist. And simple people believed that the communists had fangs, and or otherwise they had very big ears, one which they used as a mattress and the other as a blanket, and so on and so forth. But it was scary nonetheless. And then in the next year, I think it was in August of 1959, there was this great earthquake, what they call the Assam Tibet earthquake. It was much bigger than the earthquake that took place in Tibet this year. Much, much bigger. Many, many villages disappeared entirely. Large rivers were rerouted. So, and it was in those days when you didn't have the United Nations or all these other organizations that at least provide some minimal support to these people there. So in Tibet, especially in Lhasa, the earthquake had a great effect. I woke up from my bed and I was told I was crying and howling, which I often did. But my mother took me out on the street. We all came out of the house. And my mother and people with her saw all this fire in the sky, the whole sky lighting up. And she heard 14 detonations, 14 explosions. And all over Lhasa, people began to believe that in what we call, Tibetans call Lama, like the Götterdämmerung or the Ragnarok, that the gods of Tibet were now fighting the demons of China, what we Tibetans call Gyande. And everyone was nervous. And I won't talk there were many other signs and inauspicious kind of events, but I won't talk about that because, they appear in many other books, even Heinrich Harre's book and other books by other writers around there at the time. But I don't want to entirely leave Lhasa without at least mentioning one auspicious event and happy event. I was told when I was about just 1 year old, my mother took me to the Nobu Linka, the Dalai Lama's palace, in the summer when we had the opera festival, Shoten. And Tibetan opera festivals are very civilized, unlike opera festivals in the West. In Tibet, you could take babies. You could take a little Apso dog and a picnic lunch and enjoy yourselves. So I was told I was there. But that's the last, I think, kind of happy event that we had in Lhasa. And by 1950, this autumn of 1950, China began to announce that communist China was going to liberate Tibet and Taiwan from American imperialism and British imperialism. And my father had already left for his education to India, and he sent a telegram to my family in Lhasa saying, you have to get out now, it's coming close. So in October, just 2 weeks before the actual invasion of Tibet, we left Lhasa. And that was the only time I was in Lhasa, and I've never been there since. But so to carry on, this is the 18th Army, Communist Army entering the town of Thachedo on the Tibet-China frontier. This is the most important trading frontier in that area. And I wanted to let you see this image so that you can have an idea of what the Tibetan army was like that was defending the frontier. Because many Western accounts at that time talk about as if the Tibetans really didn't have any idea of what to do to defend themselves. Yes, we didn't have the resources. We are not all that strong or powerful, but we did have an army. We did have brave people to defend our own country. And as you see here, the 9th Regiment, the Tathang Maga, with his general in the front, Degese, who was the son of the king of Dirge, who had joined the Tibetan aristocracy in Lhasa and officialdom, and this was his regiment. And as you see, they're wearing traditional Tibetan uniforms, but they were uniforms, and they're armed with the British Lee Enfield rifle, which was not completely outdated even by then. This was a World War II sort of weapon, so it's fine. And as you see, even they had little drummer boys, you can see it on the left, hangover from the colonial days, and the Tibetan national flag. So this was a national army with a national flag. And I'm stressing this because, even friendly accounts about Tibet are a little they put you down a little. If you've seen the movie 7 Years in Tibet, the Tibetan soldiers some of them seem to be dressed in rags. They don't have a uniform. And some are even using a bow and arrow against the communists. I don't think there were any ill intentions, bad intentions. Maybe they wanted to show Tibetans were so peaceful that they didn't even have guns. But no, we did have guns, and we used them to defend our own country. So to move on, now I won't go into detail here, but this is one of the points in Drishu, the upper Yangtze. This is a ferry point, one of the first points of attack that 20,000 Chinese troops crossed over and attacked a Tibetan garrison here of 180 people. Maybe about 140 regular Tibetan soldiers and another 40 Kappa militia. And these people fought the Tibetans fought to the last. We have an eyewitness account later that we had a telegraph operator in eastern Tibet called Robert Ford, an very young English radio man. And he told me that he heard this actually from one survivor who was wounded and later he met in prison. And the person doing the defending on the top was General Karchung. There's another famous general below him called General Muja who fought further upstream in a place called Denko. He wiped out the first battalion that the Chinese sent against him completely. and he managed a successful withdrawal. So these were experienced fighters because we had been fighting the Chinese since the Manchu days there. And he conducted a withdrawal. But the only problem with what happened at that time was the Tibetan Governor General of Eastern Tibet had just been replaced. The older one had to return to Lhasa, and the newer one, Ngabo, that everyone had a lot of hope in, he suddenly, much to everyone's surprise, he said he is going to surrender. The Tibetan government sent telegrams saying you can't do that. You had to retreat in good form, retreat to another fortress just 100 miles away, which is much safer than Chamdo, the capital. But then he began to get nervous, and he actually not only surrendered, he surrendered to an advance guard of Chinese troops, only about 100 or so. And he surrendered about 2,000 soldiers, and even it stopped the escape of Robert Ford, who was trying to get away. As you see him here, he was captured there, along with other Tibetan soldiers you can see behind him. And he was taken down to China, and he was accused of murdering a Tibetan Lama that he didn't even know. Spent 5 years in prison, underwent thought reform or brainwashing. And this system of thought control is not something that, like people think it's just from fiction or thrillers like The Manchurian Candidate. It is a real procedure that the communists had mastered in order to make you change the way you thought about things. So he stayed for 5 years, and after 5 years, they released him. And I mention him also because when I wrote this account, I managed to contact him just a year and a half before he passed away. And he helped me with my research, not very much because he was very old by then, but he went through the few chapters I'd written on the Chamdo incident, and he was very happy that people were talking about it. Now, he said at that time, when he returned to England, he said it was very sad. Everyone was saying, especially in the more left-leaning newspapers in Britain, like The Guardian at that time, that the Chinese just fired a few firecrackers, and the Tibetans ran away. The whole idea with the communist idea was to show that the liberation of Tibet was peaceful. That's why they called it the peaceful liberation of Tibet. And of course it wasn't. A lot of the there were many Tibetan soldiers. According to new researchers now, some French scholars that I had consulted, at least about 4,000 or 5,000 Tibetans were killed. And more Chinese died actually during this invasion. So it was a real and it was a grievous sort of event at that time. And of course, the person you see on the right, looking rather sinister, actually this is not my image, this is taken by Heinrich Harrer, is the Tibetan Governor General Ngabo. And what I think, the map's not that clear here, but I'll try to explain very fast. The two images you see on the left, on the top is the former Governor General of Eastern Tibet. His name was Lalu. And the image that one is taken in 1937, and the one below is in 1959. And there's a great gap in the age. But I'm showing you this because when Ngabo surrendered, and he was supposed to return to Lhasa, this former Governor General, Lhasa told him, don't return. Try to defend the fortress that Ngabo had given up. And he tried that, but the problem was he didn't have that many troops. He just had about 400 or 500 left because Ngabo had surrendered most of the army. But he managed to collect whatever troops had managed to get away from the surrender. And he managed a very skillful withdrawal, a fighting withdrawal from that area gradually over a few months across some of the most incredible terrain in Tibet. There's at least 2 or 3 passes that are around 18,000, 19,000 feet above sea level, constantly snowed in and iced over. And this was now getting to winter. This was late October. But he managed the withdrawal, even actually managed to attack oncoming Chinese sort of advancing troops, defeated them, even mentioned in Chinese accounts. So, these sort of stories I'm telling you are not something that I sort of dreamed of. It's also now we get them from Chinese sources, because a number of the documentation in China was released some years ago. Remember when China liberalized, they allowed a number of scholars to check into local accounts and military accounts. So he managed to conduct this retreat and get all the way close to 150 miles from Lhasa city, near a river called the Nyangchu. It was a postal station called Kongbo Jamda. And by that river, he set up his final defense lines. And by that time, the prime minister in Lhasa sent him troops also from Lhasa. They had recruited new regiments, and they sent it to him. And he said this is his final defense line. And he stopped the Chinese for, I don't know if you can guess, any one of you, but for 1 full year, till the next October 28, 1951, 1 full year, he stopped them. And by that time, this military standoff created a crucial diplomatic window for Tibet. The Dalai Lama and the Kashak launched a series of desperate appeals to the United Nations, beginning with a formal plea for help on November 7, 1950. 6 days later, the Tibetan cabinet and the Tibetan Assembly made another impassioned appeal, vowing to the Secretary General that Tibet will not go down without a fight. Then we found a sponsor, the nation of El Salvador, and the diplomat there requested that the invasion of Tibet by foreign forces, be added to the General Assembly's agenda on November 24th. But Britain vetoed this discussion and crushed the initiative. Despite the setback, the Tibetan government persisted, submitting the third appeal on December 8th. Only after months of resistance and mounting pressure did Tibet finally agree to negotiate with China in March 1951. So all the while, because our army was holding that river, we got this opportunity to appeal to the United Nations. Americans were supportive, but all these big countries, they have what do you call that? The technical term is the veto. And the person who spoke out against this in Britain was the last British representative in Tibet, Hugh Richardson. He said to the press that the British had sold the Tibetans down the river. He used this term, which is actually used in the American South. When you sell slaves from up country, from Virginia down to New Orleans, it's called selling them down the river. But he said that Britain was the only country that Tibet had treaty relationships with, which the Tibetans had always honored. But, they sold us out. I met Hugh Richardson later. He was living in retirement in Scotland at St. Andrews, a very small apartment. Because the British government can be quite spiteful to people who speak up against it. They didn't give him any honors. He had no sir or whatever behind his name or in front of it. So, and beside being a great diplomat, well known in diplomatic circles, he was the great authority. He was the leading authority in Tibetan studies. A lot of the senior Tibetan academics who were working in Tibet at that time, Goldstein and others, were Richardson's students. And he got nothing. So, but nonetheless, he was always wonderful to us. Whenever I appealed to him, sometimes to write an article. I was in the Tibetan Institute of Performing Arts with Namgyal Lamala here and Chukila here. And I used to publish journals and stuff from there. And he would always write. From his small, even his pension, he sent occasional donations to Tibetan organizations. I remember Tipa getting 200 pounds from him. I was very grateful for that. I went to visit him in St. Andrews a couple of times when I was living there. He always spoke out against against the British government for that. He was never forgiving of it. And don't take my word for it. If you go on Wikipedia and go to the obituary that was written by another eminent Tibetologist, all this is there. So if I could just, if you feel I'm carrying on for too long, please yawn, and I can take very subtle hints, because I tend to do that. You must. I'm a kind of a storyteller, so So, the next, Ngabu, the Governor General I told you about earlier, who surrendered all his troops, who surrendered really without firing a shot. And if I sound if I'm venting spleen here, as we might say, I want you to know that he is related to me, to my family. So it's not like I'm just firing off, shots here. He's related to me and Wongpalai here. But he now offered his services, while he was captured by the Chinese, he offered his services as a chief negotiator to the Tibetan government. The Tibetan government's acceptance of Ngabu as a negotiator would prove to be fatally misguided. When photographed in Chengdu with Deng Xiaoping, if that's Deng Xiaoping on the right, if you see underneath, and Ngabu had already transformed his appearance. His official robes are discarded. He's not wearing them. And his traditional hair is shorn. He's already cut off his top knot. All Tibetan officials, if you're in Tibetan officialdom, you have to have a top knot. It's called the warrior's knot, pachok. It's like what the samurai have. It's the same thing, that you are part of that, because Tibetan officialdom, especially not the monk, but the lay officialdom, are supposed to fight for their country. And he had cut it off. So these were visible signs of his shifting allegiance. He had already accepted a position as vice chairman of the Chamdo Liberation Committee. This is the communist committee that was set up to rule all those parts of Tibet that the communists had just captured. Whether he actually joined the Communist Party then, we are not too sure, but he certainly had done so, a year late. But then, on May 23rd, Beijing radio broadcast news of the completed agreement for the peaceful liberation of Tibet, all signed. And it stunned the Tibetan government and the Dalai Lama alike, because they didn't know what was happening and what was going on. And His Holiness later recounted, "Neither I nor my government were told that an agreement had been signed. We first came to know of it from broadcasts that Ngabu made on Peking radio. The negotiator had signed away Tibet's future without the knowledge or consent of those he claimed to represent." So that's the sad first part of the story that's in the book. But at the same time, I wanted to tell the whole story because I wanted to write about the people who fought against the communists at that time. Nobody ran away. They all stood their ground and they ran away. And they fought. So I really wanted to stress that. Even like the other Governor General, the preceding one, who conducted the fighting withdrawal to Kombu Jamda, he was forgotten. The communists really disliked him. They made sure that even later, after they had come in, he didn't hold any more position in the government. But you know what he did? We were talking about the 59 uprising, earlier. When that uprising took place, he volunteered to join. He fought from the roof of his house. He had a Bren gun. And he and his pregnant wife had another gun. And she started firing at the Chinese. Till finally, her water burst. So her friends took her down to a storeroom, and there she managed to give birth to a child who later suffered. I think there were some complications. But he was arrested by the communists and struggled and put in prison for 20 years. So most of them were brave men, except for the Governor General. So this is the monastery of Lithang in eastern Tibet. Four kind of versions of this monastery had existed before and had been knocked down. The last was bombed to rubble, bombed and artillery. And this is one that was built, I think, only about 15, 20 years ago. I'm not too sure. The photograph was taken by an American. But I'm showing this monastery because after the initial Chinese invasion, Tibet experienced a deceptive period of calm. The Chinese occupation forces displayed calculated restraint, distributing millions of Da Yuan silver coins to high officials, lamas, even school children who attended Chinese schools. However, this superficial peace shattered in early 1956, when the nomadic tribes of Lithang in far eastern Tibet, led by Europeans and Mongol from this area, launched a fierce uprising against the Chinese forces there. The rebellion quickly spread through neighboring regions, Batang, Markham, Yarong, Chutting, Trango, and Konjo, engulfing eastern Tibet in unprecedented warfare. And the chieftain from this, if you see on the left, there's Lithang European. He's from a nomadic tribe. This photograph was taken when he was about 15 years old in the neighboring Chinese town of Tatsedo, probably in the little Chinese studio. So the conflict marked a devastating turning point in Kampa history. For the first time, their great monasteries came under air attack. Chinese forces reduced Lithang monastery that I showed you earlier to rubble through aerial bombardments and ground artillery, and numerous other monasteries suffered similar destruction. And the image of on the left is Europa, and then the center is Markham Pupape. He was the last tribal leader to hold out in eastern Tibet. And he managed to do this because the Markham, where he had his land, is covered in forests, really primeval forests, like some parts of North America. My mother told me, because she had traveled around those places, that when it rained, she and her girlfriend would just go under a tree, and the rain never came through. And these forests are so big and tremendous that it acted as a barrier against the attack by communist troops. That's why they managed to hold out till he held out the last. And also it was in Markham, the tribe, the area that he ruled, that the CIA also managed to send the last team of radio operators and guerrilla instructors and what have you to help the resistance forces there. Now, the last person that we call Rajing Simga, that's the best image I have, because his picture was taken in 1937 by a British visitor to Tibet. And because he was the bodyguard of the Tibetan regent, Rajing, the Rajing regent, he was 7 foot. And he was a very, very fierce person. His master, the Rajing regent, had problems with the Tibetan government because this regent was rather corrupt. And the Tibetan government later decided, and he was also trying to deal with the Chinese, so they tried to have him arrested. But then his very loyal bodyguard pulled out his sword. 7 Tibetan soldiers were hacked by this man. But he managed to make his escape, went back to eastern Tibet. And there, later when the communists came in, he conducted himself in a similar manner. And there are stories, unending stories about him. They said, even if you shot him, nothing happened. He killed a whole lot of people and finally disappeared into what I'm talking about, the mists of history. They retreated further down south towards the Assam-Burma border, and we haven't heard from him since. But he's someone out of fiction in some ways. So I just mentioned these because one thing I want you to understand about this book is I'm not writing history. I'm trying also to give place to people who are not really that significant, but who are interesting in their own right. Who represented some things in the Tibetan character that I wanted to get across, but who weren't important personalities or important people in the government. So this guy is one. And there are many other people. Actually, his whole book is full of it. So if you want to be entertained, there you are, But also, it's not only the men who were impressive. Two tribes in eastern Tibet that I earlier talked about, Nyarong and Konjo, their leaders at that time, their fighting leaders, were women. The person on the left, Geri Dorje Yudin, she died last year, very old. She was only about 5'3", nothing, very soft-spoken. And you could see even in the old age when I met her, that she had been very good-looking once, And she told me that she actually received a letter from the chief of ICT-Europe telling her on what date they should conduct their kind of uprising. And she tried to prepare the young men in her district, to start the uprising. But the problem was that her husband, other chieftains, had been taken by the Chinese and were being used as hostages. But nonetheless, she got her people together. The Chinese actually sent assassins after her. One entered her house, actually her own room, with a hand grenade, one of those Chinese, what the Russian called potato masher hand grenades, and was going to throw it at her. But her maid managed to grab that person's hand. The Tibetan women can be very strong, and wrestle him down on the ground, and she pulled out a pistol and shot him in the head. And then she went out, got her men together, outside the great fortress of Drukmuzong in Nyarong. And then she told them, by then she had dressed, put on a man's chuba, put on a sword and a pistol. And she told her men, you have to attack this fortress. Anyone steps back, I'm going to kill him myself personally. And those guys believed her, They said, lasso, lasso, and then they charged the fort. And she was wonderful. I interviewed her for quite a long time. And she had wonderful stories. Then the person next to her was also a nun, but she took to, let's say, her religious kind of aspirations very young. She didn't want to be married. She didn't want to join her father in the tribe. She just wanted to be a religious practitioner. But her father, who was fighting at the time, the chieftain of Konjo, was killed in battle. So the men came, they said, you are the only kind of blood descendant of our chief, so you have to take over. So she took over. And she was very fierce. And there were people against her. Some young men, they said, oh, God, we don't want a woman, sort of bossing us around. And she told 3 or 4, grab that man. And they grabbed, she said, bring him here. And she said, take off his pants, So they took his chuba up and pulled out his pants. And then she took a whip and she gave him a nice whipping. And then later on he said, Gonda, I'm sorry. And that's the end of the story. She kept fighting for years after that, till they retreated from eastern Tibet, step by step. And finally she reached Charapemba, where the CIA actually managed a big airdrop. And she managed to get weapons for her and the people. But even then, they were losing all the time. In the end, she had nothing left except her mother, herself, and she had the rifle. She was carrying her own grandmother and walking. All her horses had been shot. And she was captured, taken to Lhasa and put in prison for 19 years. And finally, she came to Dharamsala. And I met her and talked to her. And It was wonderful, to have people like that there. People who were never victims, who never saw themselves as victims. They never even saw themselves in some ways as refugees. They were always people who, who took charge of events as far as they could, and so these were people and there are many other women, and maybe I'll discuss one more of our female leads later, but how much time do I have? Sometime later. Okay, yeah. All right, okay. Yeah, so, okay, so let's get back to this. Like when this fighting was taking place in eastern Tibet, and as I told you earlier, it started in one of the tribes in Litang, but it spread all over eastern Tibet, everywhere. There wasn't one area of of eastern Tibet, of Kham, where there was no fighting. Nearly all the monasteries in those areas were bombed, and then people began to leave Lhasa in droves. Leave eastern Tibet and come to Lhasa. Because Lhasa, like everyone knew Chinese were already in Lhasa by that time. But still, Lhasa was a spiritual sanctuary because the Dalai Lama was there. So I think it's important that, okay, I'm going to skip this whole part about Amdo, the fighting. Is there any Amdoa here among us? Then maybe I have to talk about Amdo, but I don't think there'll be that much time. But, the whole Amdo account is interesting because Xi Jinping's father, Shi Tongshun, the present president of, his father was involved in the pacification in Amdo. And that's why some of the accounts that I got from Amdo, and this is just, no, hold on. If you see, the person on the left, Nangra Digzin, had given a full account in Dharamsala. And the thing is, I won't go into it, but his account was so full of the fighting. He gave day and date, time, number of people, what Chinese regiments were there, that I began to get a little suspicious. I was very young. In those days, the fashion in academia was to distrust refugee reports, especially where they came from anti-communist sort of sources. But then, so I thought, and then also he mentions the fact that their uprising was so kind of powerful. It affected the Chinese so much that the Chinese said these people were trying to start a new Taiwan. And then I thought, oh, guy, he's exaggerating. But then in 2000 and, when was it? This was in 2012, when Xi Jinping was coming up as a president, that a lot of publications came out in China in their military journals, and they began to talk about actually this uprising of Nangra Rizin in Nangra. And they said these people were actually trying to create a Taiwan. So I thought, wow, like I had spoken too soon. And then they said how big it involved, like about 30,000 Tibetans fighting there. For 3 years, till finally they were cornered in this really high, snowy, icy peak, surrounded by Chinese troops, but they would not surrender. There were only about few hundred, I think, people left. And they kept surviving. They were freezing, and in order to get some sustenance, they would cut their horses' throats and drink the blood and keep on going, keep a few horses there ready for the next meal. But that's the only way they survived. Till finally, Shi Tongshun, Xi Jinping's father, he got involved because he was the political commissar for the area. And he sent well-known Tibetan lamas from Amdo and even from central Tibet, Sherab Kyamso and the others, with a lot of women also from their area to go up with them, partway to scream and shout and cry. And these lamas went up. And finally, the men from that area came down and surrendered. Shi Tongshun himself Mao Zedong invited him to Beijing. And I think they said that even a small banquet was arranged for him, where Mao gave a speech to the other political bigwigs. He said Shi Tongshun is an example, and he used that. Have you ever read or heard of this great Chinese novel called The Romance of the Three Kingdoms? It's a wonderful novel, great Chinese literary classic. There they have these heroes fighting. It's derived from Chinese history. And one of the generals there, the famous person, was called Zhuge Liang. He was a great strategic thinker. And so Mao used this example. He said, Xi Jinping's father, Shi Tongshun, is the Zhuge Liang of the Communist Party now. And so this is. So if I just want to put this in perspective, and why I'm bringing all these out is, a lot of the communist publications that you see, propaganda, they never talk about Tibetan fighting. They want to make out that the whole, their takeover of Tibet was peaceful, and they don't want to talk about Tibetan heroism and all the violence that went into Eastern Tibet. The kind of documentation that I collected, and which the Tibetan government has collected over the years, which we've never really been able to disseminate that well into the world. It's near genocide, but we've never been able to push it out to the world. We talk of people being killed, but not of genocide. But if we regard what happened to Native Americans, as genocide, equally the same things happened in Eastern Tibet. Right now, we are beginning to find graves in the grasslands in places called Kikudo and these areas. Why? Because now there's more construction. The Chinese are spending a lot of money on construction, buildings, roads, what have you. And when they dig the soil, you have all these bones coming out. Bones, skulls still with hair in them, their shirts sometimes, all over the place. So it's important that, these things, one individual like me just cannot sort of research. But evidence is there. And I run a little research center in New York. I've even managed to collect, let's say, statistics that the Chinese themselves, from their population census of 1978, that's reproduced in an atlas in Oxford. It shows Tibetan male population dropping dramatically all over Eastern Tibet, which never happened even during the famine. In famine, male population and female population, the death rate is about the same. But when the male are fighting in these areas, so many of them are killed. Dramatic differences. So these are like little bits of evidence that I try to knit together to make a convincing story for you to read. Now, okay, when in 1956 all this fighting was taking place in Eastern Tibet, monasteries were bombed. Unfortunately, the world's attention was taken up at that time by the Hungarian Uprising. When Stalin's tanks were rolling into Hungary, there was no time for Tibet. Comparisons are odious, but actually the fighting in Eastern Tibet was bigger and took far longer, many, many years. Monasteries were being bombed, but even in India, the press didn't take notice of what was happening across in the Himalayas, their backyard. But one person, his name is Gigan Dorje Thachin. He's an ethnic Tibetan, but born in the Indian side of the border, in a place called Kinnaur. He was an orphan that had been raised by Moravian missionaries. And later, when he reconnected with his Tibetan roots, he became really proud of Tibet, and he wanted to do something for Tibet. So he started the first Tibetan newspaper in 1923. And he received a little sort of seed money from the 13th Dalai Lama, who was fond of him. And he began to publish stories of what was happening in Eastern Tibet, first-person accounts. And since we didn't have photographs and he didn't have war photographers running around in Tibet. He got someone from there to actually try to draw the bombing of the monasteries. And this is Chhating Monastery being bombed at that time. So, now, I'll have to rush through everything. Anyways, the thing is, I'll stop when I have to stop. And then questions that can be asked. But, you know, like, I told you about the refugees now coming into Lhasa at that time. And the Dalai Lama's sort of biography mentions about 10,000 more refugees. I think actually far more, because nobody really kept count. But you must remember the Lhasa city, the population was 20,000. So when you have 10 to 15,000 refugees, you know, there are problems. And these are all poor refugees coming in just, you know, just with a weapon maybe, no food, wearing rags. And they're camped out in the parks in Lhasa. Lhasa has many wonderful parks. They're out there. And these were angry people. So at that time, the People's Liberation Army had brought in about 30,000 troops around that area with artillery, armored cars, even tanks. And so the whole of Lhasa became a tinderbox. And it was around that time, but nobody really knew what to do next. There were protests in Lhasa. There were people who came out and protested. The Tibetan government officials, many of them, patriotic ones, did object to what the Chinese were trying to do. But there, I have to say a few things. One thing at least. You know, when the refugees came, the occupation authorities in Lhasa told the Tibetan Kashak, you know, the cabinet, you have to return these people to eastern Tibet. They have to be sent back. Use whatever police you have here to chase them out. And I'm proud to say that the Tibetan cabinet, you know, it was weak in places, but they stood up and said, no, we won't do this. You know, so in my book I talk about the fact that, you know, the Vichy government, when the Nazis told them you have to give up your French citizens of Jewish background, they did it. But the Tibetans held out. So there are a few things I'm proud of. I mean, I make a lot of, I criticize the old regime places, but there are places where they really did what they had to do. And they were even kind of sneaky at times. They sort of like, when the communists said that whatever few troops you have to send to eastern Tibet to fight the Khampas, and they couldn't refuse, so they came up with a very good excuse. They said, yeah, we can do this, but, you know, first we have to increase our troop size, so you must allow us to increase our army. And then you must also give us new weapons. And then the communists didn't want to do that, so that became a closed subject. Now, so the person who actually started, after all these years, after all the fighting in eastern Tibet, who started the whole resistance again, was from Lhasa, but he was a Khampa. His name was Andu Gombatashi. Very low-key Khampa. Most Khampas in Lhasa city especially are well-dressed, very manly, you know, kind of macho people, wearing those fancy riding boots and everything. But he was a very low-key sort of Khampa, only with his prayer beads. He never raised his profile. But he was well known in the monastic circles as Andu Jinda, as the great benefactor, because he was very generous to all the monasteries, to all the monks. He would give out a lot of money. And so the Chinese didn't suspect him at all. But then he began to call in favors to all the Tibetan abbots, monastic managers, and this and that. And he began to send representatives to the Dalai Lama's Lord Chamberlain, Kongopala, who was one of the great kind of, who was the kind of person who planned the Dalai Lama's escape actually in 1959. And to get to him and to ask the Dalai Lama to give special teachings. One was the Lamrim, teaching, and they won't go deep, and also one was the long life prayer for the Dalai Lama. But the difference this time was it was not, he requested this not from individual sources or from one sponsor or the other, but from the people of the three traditional regions of Tibet, Amdo, Kham, and Central Tibet. For a while in Tibet, especially after the Manchus had left, there was a kind of exhaustion within the Tibetan sort of culture about even extending, taking pride in the old empire of the Tibetan emperors. So people had forgotten in some ways or lost contact with Amdo and even with Kham. But now he began to revive that in a very subtle way, just through these prayers that he requested. That, and the sponsors of these prayers are the people of the Chokasum, the three regions. And that began to be revived. And then he asked for one special puja, which was the Kala Chakra puja. And I think this was the Dalai Lama's first Kala Chakra puja, which he might, some of you may have heard, he had this all over the world. Now, there's one thing special about the Kala Chakra. I am not a religious expert, and I can see there is one person here in this room who might argue with me about it. But the Kala Chakra is an unusual tantra. It was one of the last tantras to come from India to Tibet. And after that, of course, the Muslim invasions took place, and Buddhism practically got wiped out in India. And also the Kala Chakra is unusual. It doesn't, that it is apocalyptic. It's not very Buddhist in that sense. It is the end of days kind of tantra. That the world is going to disappear when all the evil demons and evil sort of extends its power all over the world. But then the kings of Shambhala, which is this glorious sort of nation hidden somewhere, and all of you have heard of the stories of Shambhala, but then the Shambhala kings would come again and then defeat the forces of evil and and create a new golden age for people. Now the thing is, if you have taken the Kala Chakra Tantra initiation, you are guaranteed a seat at that time. So for people in Tibet at that time, because it was so traumatic under the Chinese, so people are just rushing. And it became a huge affair and very successful. And after that, Gompa Tashi began to sort of have some meetings and said, the Dalai Lama has been so wonderful by giving us this teaching. We have to give something back. And what he did was, he said, let's offer him this throne, a special throne. And people said, look, the Dalai Lama already has thrones. He's got a throne in the Potala and one in the Nobulinka. He said, no, this has got to be a special one. This will be the most magnificent throne that Tibet has already seen, a golden throne. So there were, I think, few hundred kilograms of gold collected, jewels, this, that, and other, 90 or goldsmiths, silversmiths employed. The management alone, there were just a few hundred people involved, and he used this as a cover in some ways to create his organizations. He could get people to work, to create a resistance organization. So the Chinese never suspected. But gradually, in the matter of months, he had put together the whole resistance organization. And this is not a very good photograph, but what we have of him, Gompa Tashi, reviewing the first resistance army to the south of Tibet, a place called Tigutang by a lake. And to move on, and these are his big generals and fighters on the left. But the person on the right with spectacles, I just wanted to point that out. He was a Chinese colonel of artillery. He was quite big in the PLA. He defected to the Tibetans. And he was a great fighter. All the Tibetans, first thing they did when he defected, they took him to an oracle, because we have great faith in these things. And they asked him, what do you think of this guy? And the oracle said, he'll be very useful to you. Trust him. So they trusted him, and he fought the communists. He really fought well. Finally, he came out with when the Dalai Lama escaped to India, he came out with them, and he went to a resettlement camp in the south. And he even managed to find a wife there. And I think he's got some children. But the old man's dead. But there's a biography published in Chinese in Taiwan, and there's also in Tibetan, and I think one in English in the library in Dharamsala. So, yeah, these are all the stories of these people. And this is like, Gompo Tashi went to, finally he had to find a cache of weapons. He was running out of weapons and ammunition. And he knew there was a Tibetan government stash in a place called Gandhachengo to the west. But when he got those weapons there, the problem was the communists came after him. And then he took his force at that time. I think he had about 700, 800 people with him. They were all riding. And they were attacked from everywhere. And they kept on riding. And I call it at least, Gompo Tashi's great ride north across the Changtang, which is one of the most highest and windiest places in the world. And these people rode for 5,000 kilometers, easily from Paris to, let's say, to Baghdad, with fighting most of the way, fighting all the time, being ambushed here, ambushed there. And Gompo Tashi, by this time, he was an old man. He was about 60. He had about 12 pieces of shrapnel in his body. But they finally came. And for me, this is one of the great epic sort of journeys in history. Earlier I was talking to Fritz here from like Xenophon's March of the 10,000, and the Anabasis. So it's something like that. And the communists talk about Mao Zedong's, great long march, which I think was 6,000 kilometers. The Tibetan was 5,000, but we were fighting all the way, and also it only took about 2.5 months, and the Chinese took about nearly a year to conduct that. Comparisons are odious, but I'm not I tend to do that sometimes. But Gompo Tashi, the great thing with that, he managed to revive the entire. By the time he actually reached eastern Tibet, crossing all the way to Changtang, when he got there, from about 800 riders, he had about 50 left. And when he got to Changha Pember, some stragglers came, and it made up 120, 30 people. But people heard his name in eastern Tibet again, although they had given up by then. They surrendered their weapons, everything. All the people came to him. And he managed to raise again another army there of 20, 30,000 people. But they didn't have weapons. And by that time, he had to get back to base, to get to a radio, to tell the Americans that we've got people, but we need the weapons. But that is another story. And that is also really epic. I won't go into details here because I don't think there's that much time. But
it's in the book.
It's in the book. Yeah, and but I have to say one thing, because I don't know how it is here in Holland. I'm sure you're very liberal people. But the problem in the liberal left, the moment you say you've had anything to do with the CIA, oh, you're totally uncool, And it's really annoying to think that, CIA people are just like, what Graham Greene had written about, people who are alcoholics and people who are nasty and right-wing fascists. No, the people who worked with the Tibetans, I met a few. They're wonderful people that I knew. And I end the book actually talking about visiting Camp Hale, where they trained the Tibetans. It's very high in Colorado, about 12,000 feet, and the same altitude as Lhasa. And they had a camp there. They trained about 300 odd Tibetans there. So, and there, what happened was, I had to go there because some of the CIA personnel, some of the leaders there, they organized, they managed to get in touch with the senator from Colorado, who was a great mountain climber, who just loved Kathmandu and the Tibetans there. And he managed to pass through a bill in Congress to allow this commemorative plaque to be put up in that area. So at least let's go fast forward to the plaque. There's the CIA, and the Cultural Revolution. Yeah, this is the plaque that was set up there. And I can't read it from here. So after my talk, you can come close and read it. But it was a wonderful event. And a lot of the old CIA people came, and a lot of their sons and daughters, people who had died, came. So they were trying to tell all the younger people how important it was for their parents, their fathers, to be involved with this. It's one of the few operations that the CIA conducted which didn't leave a bad taste. It was not like the Bay of Pigs or anything for these people. It was important. So, okay, just to conclude and just to give it a little snappy ending and not just zip through. The CIA in Langley, where they have their headquarters, they actually have a museum of intelligence, and even an art gallery, art gallery of sorts, nothing like the Rijksmuseum or anything. And there, they've commissioned paintings of moments when CIA operations succeeded. And there are two paintings which I have at the end, if you don't mind. Oh, yeah, this one. Is when the Tibetans used to conduct raids across Mustang in northern Nepal, and where I actually went later, joined the resistance there. And one of my sort of buddies at that time, a guy called Rakrak Gadar, the big guy, really fierce, he went out on the raid there, destroyed a few trucks, and he managed to come across documents, bags of them. Actually, they just saw one bag here, bags of them, that proved to the world for the first time that there had been these huge famines in China, that Mao's Great Leap Forward was a total disaster, and so many other things. By that, China was exhausted by that time, especially after it split with Russia and the Cultural Revolution. China had sort of basically beggared itself. Industries were stopped, agriculture had come to a near stop. Higher education in China for 10 years had completely stopped. And all these documents came with this, from the Tibetans to the CIA. Because in Western academia at the time, I'm not sure how it was in Holland, but I know in Harvard, the dean of China Studies in Harvard said, Mao Zedong, no, there couldn't have been a famine at all. Mao is he's a kind of agrarian reformer. He's not even a communist. That's what they say. And it's the same everywhere else. And the Tibetan documents disprove that. Then gradually, this was passed on to the State Department, and they released it, and it came out in New York Times. Then did a series of articles on what had actually happened in China, and that was when this whole issue came out. And the Tibetan the raid was very important to the CIA. So this is one painting by a British art historian, military artist called George Woodcock, I think his name was. And the next one is of Tibetans being dropped in the clear moonlight of the Tibetan highlands into Tibet. And there were many, many drops. It wasn't one or two. Some first drops are just agents, 4 or 5 people being dropped, but later on it was like just equipment, even anti-aircraft weapons, anti-tank weapons, teams of 15, 18, 20 trainees. Many Tibetans were dropped in Tibet. And the fighting in eastern Tibet especially continued much later, till I told you it ended in the 1970s. And so, yeah, I'm going to stop here. It's not only the fact that I'm sure you all have some questions to ask, but also I've been doing this on the road for the last 1 week, so, my throat's become a little weak. Anyway, I'll try to answer any questions that you may have on this or any other kind of topics you might want to raise. Or you want to make a comment about what I said, please go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Jamyang. Very interesting. I'm sure there will be quite a few questions, and I will walk around with the microphone. Just about the CIA operations, I'm not sure, probably most of you know about it, but maybe for some it's new. There is a fantastic documentary film about it, The Shadow Circus, which was made by Tenzin Narito 30 years ago. And I think they're now making a new new documentary about it.
They've actually done it.
It's already finished.
They've managed to, I think they used the original and they added stuff to it and did new commentary and everything.
Yeah. Because the original one had a high dominance of the Americans that were part of it, and they explained and they told about their experience and why they did it, etc. But lacking was a little bit the Tibetan voice, and I think that's now part of the new new documentary.
Tashdele, I was wondering how was life in the Mustang base, so day-to-day life, when you were a guerrilla fighter?
Actually, by the time I got to Mustang, they had the first year was very rough for them. The whole area is very high, and there's very little grassland, so it's hard on food. So I think for few months, a lot of them survived on boiling old saddlebags and boots and, what have you. Some people died also at the time. Because the CIA were not committed to starting this Mustang base. But then after a year, I think the CIA agreed to drop weapons. And then we started that and we managed to, and all the Tibetan business people in Darjeeling who had money, there are quite a lot of business community there. They pooled money and they managed to get money out to Mustang by that time, rupees and Nepalese rupees also. But the area was very remote. It was so remote that even the Mustang people themselves at that time, I mean, none of them are going to admit to this now, wouldn't take even Nepalese government paper money. They wanted the old silver coins from the Malla days, So we had to, again, go to the bank in Kathmandu and get bags of silver. So it was difficult. People died. It was cold. But then by the time I came, all the different kind of posts we had out there. Kampas, one thing, they are great architectures, They had put up wonderful buildings, they planned everything. Even the water sources from the mountains, they had put wooden pipes, logs that are hewn out and joined together. Some, even logs that they hollowed. And in winter also, like places where you could divert the water so the logs wouldn't freeze and burst. These guys were fantastic. I was so impressed when I got there. Actually, I was kind of a smart aleck kid from a, kind of Raj English type school. So I thought I knew everything. But when I got there, these guys were really on the ball. And, it was hard because of the altitude. And I was a soft kid from India. And these guys would just march everywhere. But when you try to get across passes like 18,000, 19,000 in winter, then I knew, like, you're carrying a Garand rifle, 200 or 300 rounds of ammunition, hand grenades, this and that. Initially, you looked good in it, but then when you're walking, your heart, this is one thing you really see. You're not just exhausted. You feel your heart's going to pound itself out of your chest. But over time, these people helped me out, and, one of the tricks the Tibetan have is that you have to boil a lot of, you have to melt butter hot and you have to drink it. And initially I thought, whatever they tell me, I'll do. And then, actually, after a while, your skin begins to shine. You don't get fat or anything. It's just like your body glows. Or you drink blood from a, female yak from the heart, what we call yingta, I mean, in Europe also, in the old days, in the consumptives used to drink blood. It's supposed to help you, especially people who have tuberculosis in Europe in the old days. I think there's a short story of one of these that I forget, a French writer, but that's what I did, and we survived. Yeah, it was for me, it was a great experience. I met a lot of people who became good friends of mine, and when the whole thing finished in '74, and my boss at that time, Gyato Wangdu, who was the commander, he died in an ambush. The Nepalese set up an ambush, and they would kill him. But he was a great hero. He was 6'4", 6'3", big guy. And when they started shooting and they shot his horse, and some of his men got behind a rock with the rifle, he just took his rifle and he charged up against them, And of course they gunned him down, but that was what the kind of person he was. So it was a tremendous privilege for me to have been with these people, and I remember them with great affection and great admiration.
Thank you very much, Tasidele. His Holiness has referred several times for his sympathy for Marxism. And in that continuation, he also remarked, of course, he wasn't talking about the dictature of the Soviet regime. But he also mentioned that there were many Tibetans who were actually not in favor, but not very unsympathetic to some of the early Russian vision of socialism that he says had never really existed yet. But I would be really intrigued if you know a little bit more about the situation of the time that he is referring to, when also in Tibet there was some sympathy for that type of, what Marx was teaching.
Now the thing is, His Holiness, the way, when he talked about this, he was talking much later. Like he was taken down to China, I think in 1954. I think this was the first, the China National People's Congress. And when they took him down there, they made a huge show of it. It was tremendous. When he reached the railway station, there were bands, there were, different nationalities, all dressed up in their finery, school children, thousands of people welcoming him. They did the same thing with Nixon and Kissinger and all when they come. Under Stalin also, they did the same thing with many Western intellectuals and leaders who came. George Bernard Shaw and all, when they went to Moscow, they were feted. And the same thing was done in China, not only to Tibetans, but even to the Western intellectuals, Western writers, so many of them. And His Holiness believed it, they were sincere. Mao Zedong was very kind to His Holiness. His Holiness remembers that. He said in one Indian newspaper kind of interview, he said, Mao was like a father to me. And one of the people who traveled with the Dalai Lama from Tibet down to China in the jeep was a Tibetan called Baba Phunzo Wangkil, and who was leading kind of a communist from this area of Batang, which was earlier under Chinese sort of occupation. And he was a Tibetan Marxist. And, don't get me wrong. I think he was totally naive, this person, Phunzo Wangkil, because he put his faith in Marxism. He actually sold Tibet out. He helped the communists to bring the troops into Tibet. He even tried to get supplies from them, from other Tibetans. And in the end, what did they do? He was put in prison for 21, 22 years, very long actually, in solitary confinement. When they got him out, they also called his prison where he was China's Bastille. That's how the dissidents, called it. And one dissident, Chinese dissident writer at the time, told me that he had forgotten how to talk when he came out. He was not even allowed to talk to the guards. His wife committed suicide. He had 2 children who were basically beggars. Some of them, I think they came out to India, right? And got education, and came out to the United States and managed, right? and they got an education and things. But so there was him, and then Ngapu, the Governor General who surrendered. He became a Communist Party member, but His Holiness had for some time, I think, this admiration for Marxism and Leninism. And even in the exile world, there were young people, because that was a time also in the 60s, in the world, radical the radical left, everywhere in the world, it was a fashion, even in universities. I was, to be honest, I never believed in it. Maybe very early, when I was 15, we are all, in some ways at that time, wide-eyed, starry-eyed. But then I began to study China. I was asked also to work on interviewing people, refugees and this and that. And when you hear the truth, and later on I studied, did China studies, especially on communist China, because I didn't work for the CIA actually. I worked for the French intelligence. When the French wanted some part of the Tibetan, intelligence products, they were paying the Tibetan government, and I was a liaison between them. So I studied, I had to do China studies in Paris. So I trained there for a year and a half. So I lost all my kind of faith in Marxism, Leninism, and I am still not in any way convinced that there's anything that Tibet could have benefited from it. Whatever was wrong with the Tibetan system in the past, and there are many things wrong, but the system was unfair. It wasn't democratic, but it didn't go around murdering its citizens, So I feel it's important that we draw a distinction between such systems that sound great, like, Chinese policies of what they call democratic socialism, democratic reforms and what they would do in Tibet. Nothing happened. We just had famine after famine. We had death, insurrection, fighting, and people in forced labor camps, hundreds of thousands of people. And that system still goes on now, although they've got a much better kind of, let's say, propaganda system where you really don't get to see what's going on at all. But it is going on. And therefore, I think much as I admire His Holiness for many, many, many things, and I've talked to him about this. He knows, actually. We've even had a few arguments here and there. I totally disagree with him on the idea of the fact that Marxism and Leninism would have helped Tibet in any way.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Jamyang Norbu. Thanks for bringing more than 1 century of Tibetan history together. This book brings down more than a century. And you do it in a way where you bring your personal experience together with academic, scientific research and truth-making, truth-seeking through witness accounts. There's a lot of witness accounts, and many of us in this room have worked or are working on finding truth, and partly also through witness accounts. And it's not the first chapter, but early on in the book you also reflect on that, because when we seek truth, even in this age where truth could be transparent, but actually it's not, it's contested. But when we seek truth, the focus often is on is this really reliable if it is an eyewitness account? I'm just mentioning what you write. That's often the focus, and you deal with that subject at length, and it's very convincing and important that we recognize how important witness accounts are. And as you said earlier, only now the truth is coming up because Chinese are digging up their soils, well, the soils in Tibet, and now the evidence is actually confirming that genocide happened, and genocide is still happening in many places today. So this book is very important in many ways. And thanks a lot for being here today. And thanks, of course, to you to be here as well.
And I just wanted to say that, thank you again once, Jan Willem, for you said one of your goals with the publication of this book was to empower and inspire the future generations and the youth. And as a youth myself, having discussed this book with many of my peers, I can confidently say that, you were successful in that, but the job is not done, and we're hoping that your book will be published here in Europe for many more people to get the chance to read it. Luckily, we have a few copies on sale tonight, so Jan Willem will be outside signing some books. So yes, thank you all so very much for joining us.